Ladies, gentlemen, bears, bulls, welcome to today's video. Since our last check-in, Rocket Lab has seen the successful launch of Electron number 48, aka Ready Aim Pre-Fire. This was the first of two back-to-back launches for the NASA Pre-Fire mission, with a second launch planned to take place on June 1st. This will be Rocket Lab's third launch for Q2, seventh launch for 2024, and Rocket Lab's shortest turnaround time between launches. This record was previously held between Electron number 35 and 36, with 8 days in between. Worth mentioning as well, that was between two entirely different launch sites, Mahia and Virginia. The previous record for shortest turnaround time between the same launch site would be 14 days between Electron 27 and Electron 28. Looking ahead to launch number 50, Kinéis shipped their nanosatellites on May 21st, and they arrived to New Zealand on May 28th. With a launch window between June 10th and July 9th, it seems like we're well on track to land right in the middle around mid-June. So moving on to some housekeeping, in the last video I mentioned that there was an additional $3 million that was being awarded to the pre-fire contract, and that we could see this reflected in Q2's launch guidance. However, it was pointed out to me that this is more than likely to be reflected in Space Systems revenue, if anything. Now, while Q2 guidance is for $105 to $110 million, this $3 million is negligible, and I'm still in the camp that this is probably already baked into the guidance, but I felt like the correction was worth mentioning. Now, let's get into the topic of the video. Something else that I was asked about in the last video was why I left something out. I'm going to do a quick recap of the last video, and then we can get into what was left out and why I left it out. So if you saw the last video, skip ahead a few seconds, and if you haven't seen the last video, there are a few numbers that might seemingly appear out of nowhere. These are from the previous video, so if you want that additional context, pause here and jump back to the last video. I'll post a link to the video in the description below, but either way, I'll be sure to explain things as we go, and I'll make sure that things are clear along the way. So, let's get into it. So on May 15th, Rocket Lab's CFO Adam Spice spoke at the Bank of America Industrials Conference. There were a few comments in particular that really stuck out to me. When Rocket Lab reports their quarterly earnings, their business segments are broken into launch services and space systems. During the conference, space systems was further broken down into merchant components and satellite manufacturing. So for those unfamiliar, the merchant components, this is buying the individual parts of the satellite. So your star trackers, your reaction wheels, the satellite bus, etc. The satellite manufacturing, however, is bringing an idea to Rocket Lab and having them develop and build the entire satellite in-house. So in the last video, we zoomed into the backlog for each of these subsegments. The part that we skimmed over, however, is the comment made about merchant components being a $140 million run rate business with a 20-ish% CAGR. For those unfamiliar, a CAGR is a compounded average growth rate. And in simple terms, it's a way to measure how fast something, like an investment or a business, is growing over time. So the reason that I left this part out is because I'm unclear if Adam was talking about past growth or if he's basically guiding forwards. And because of this uncertainty, this is why I left it out. But since I was asked about it, I figured let's have some fun with it. So if he is talking about previous growth, it's not clear-cut to use that as a touch point, as some of this revenue was purchased in the form of acquisitions. So your Solero, your Advanced Solutions, your Planetary Systems Corp, etc. But if he is meaning the CAGR going forward is going to be 20%, well, this is something we can work with. So taking this $140 million annual run rate, then dividing this by 4, arrives us at the quarterly run rate. From here, we can take this $35 million and iterate this by 4.6% quarter over quarter. This 4.6% quarterly translates to the 20% annually that was mentioned. This is an oversimplified means of modeling forward what to expect for the merchant components subsystems of Rocket Lab's space systems. So we're going to put a pin in this, and we're going to circle back to this again in a moment. So in the last video, we only went out as far as to the end of 2024. In this video, let's look out to 2025 to 2027. And before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's revisit the MDA contract to look at the recognition structure. This is an example of one of those numbers that was brought from the last video. So you might be wondering where this is coming from, the last video. In 2022, 0 to 4.5 million of the MDA contract was recognized. In 2023, 31.8, leaving us in 2024 with 106.6 to 111.2 to be recognized. This arrives us to the total contract value of 143 million. So translated as a percent, roughly 3/4 of the contract value was recognized in 2024. The reason that this is worth mentioning is because based on commentary when the SDA contract was awarded, for the forward-looking contracts we can expect the revenue recognition to not be so backloaded like we saw with MDA. In other words, recognized more smoothly over the period of time. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Victus Haze because that is the smaller of the contracts, and then we're going to expand into the SDA contract. So for Victus Haze, we're going to assume that the entire contract value is recognized in 2025. Now, the total contract is worth 32 million, and this also includes launch. So what we've done is we've essentially shaved 1/3 off of the contract value and assuming that to be put aside for the launch. So we're assuming the launch to be somewhere in the range of $10 to $12 million, leaving us with the satellite being 20 million. So for Q1, we're going to assume that 20% of this contract is recognized. In Q2 and Q3, 25%, leaving us with Q4 of 30%. So translating this into revenue, 4 million for Q1, 5 million for Q2 and Q3, and 6 million for Q4, leaving us with that total of $20 million, not including the launch. Now for SDA, this is a much larger contract. We can expect the revenue for this one to be recognized primarily over a 3-year period between 2025 and 2027. As mentioned in the last video, the total contract value is $515 million, of which we assume $9 million to be recognized in 2024, leaving out the operating revenue that will take place between 2028 and 2030 of $6 million. This leaves us with $505 million to be recognized between 2025 and 2027. So the way that we're going to split this up is we're going to assume 25% in the first year, 30% in the second year, and 45% in the final year. Translating this into revenue, 126.3, 151.5, and 227.3. Past this, it's worth mentioning that there is also a quarterly adjustment being made behind the scenes. The purpose for this is to remove the blocky jumps between annual recognition and smooth them out into something that's a little more realistic. Now before we tie this all together, we also need to consider the other part that is Rocket Lab, the launch side of the business. So what we did for the Electron is we did a community poll for the number of Electron launches expected in 2027 and the revenue that will be expected from each launch also in 2027. Now before we move on to the Neutron, I'm expecting something a little bit lower. I would expect more like 25 to 30 launches in 2027 with an average sales price of 9 million, but we're going to go with what the community voted for here. So ultimately arriving us at $350 million for Electron for 2027. Now for the Neutron, we know that management is targeting 5 launches in 2027 with an average sales price somewhere between $55 to $60 million. This will bring us to $300 million for the full year for Neutron alone. Next up, we're going to bring that components revenue back in from earlier. If we take that $140 million run rate and grow that by 20% year over year, it's going to look something like $259.4 million for 2027. Finally, we have SDA in its final year of recognition, landing us at $227.3 million, bringing us to the total revenue for the full year of 2027 of $1.1 billion. Now that we have full year 2027 laid out, we can attempt to arrive at a valuation, and you can see why things aren't so clear-cut when it comes to Rocket Lab. So taking Rocket Lab's 2027 full year revenue and multiplying it by the historic average price-to-sales ratio of a number of well-known indices, this generates a set of numbers that is sure to upset some Rocket Lab bulls. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that Rocket Lab lands another 2 SDA-sized contracts that are virtually identical to the original, with 1 year in between each contract. So while the original is being recognized between 2025 to 2027, the second will be 2026 to 2028, and the third between 2027 and 2029. Finally, we will also assume the same recognition structure we went over earlier. So putting this all together increases total revenue from 1.1 billion to 1.4 billion and assumes a market cap in the range of 1.5 to 3, maybe 3.5 billion. So between a negative 20% impact and a 50% increase to the current valuation. In other words, 3.5 to roughly $5 per share. Now, I'm aware that I'm going to be told that despite comparing Rocket Lab to 6 different indices, that I'm doing it wrong. And I partially agree. A company shouldn't be valued based on revenue alone, because rather than worrying about the revenue, we should worry about the quality of the revenue. So think operating profit, earnings, cash flow, etc. But revenue is what we're working with for this video, and it's the comparison that I constantly see online. That Relativity is worth $4 billion, so Rocket Lab should be worth more. Or that Firefly is worth $1.5 billion and Rocket Lab is launching more often. Or the easy example is that SpaceX has a price to sales of 20, so Rocket Lab should have something similar. One example that I never hear is ULA. With a valuation of $2 to $4 billion and revenue of $2 billion, this puts it at a price to sales of 1 to 2. And if we apply the same metric to Rocket Lab, this would put Rocket Lab at a valuation of 0.5 to 1 billion, or $1 to $2 per share. Now obviously, ULA and Rocket Lab are very different companies, but so are SpaceX and Rocket Lab, and Firefly and Rocket Lab, and Relativity and Rocket Lab. And this kind of trying to compare companies that sort of are similar but not quite similar, this is the exact same sentiment that led to the dot-com bubble. And I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but I am saying it's reckless to rule that out completely. One final bullish point that I'll make is that these numbers don't reflect what will become Rocket Lab's constellation. Now, whether that's operating in 2027 or, we're on the brink of it operating in 2027, that's completely left out. So if this does come to fruition, maybe it does make sense that Rocket Lab commands a price to sales of 20, like SpaceX would, but also maybe not. When I zoom out and I look at the market as a whole, there are companies that are valued similarly to Rocket Lab that don't run the risk of 1/3 of their business being shut down for weeks, if not months at a time, if somebody forgets to do something as simple as fastening a bolt. And there is no clear-cut way to value a company, and this can cause a kind of disconnect in public perception, which if you're here watching this video or are a Rocket Lab investor, you're more than well aware of. So I'm often lovingly critiqued for being bearish, if not too conservative, and that's fine. I realize I value stocks like a boomer, but what I'm going to do is I want to pitch it to you, the viewer. What valuation metric do you think is valid? We've kind of gone over the revenue here, and I'm expecting pushback, and rightfully so. Even myself, like I said, it's a cheap metric to use, but should it be based on earnings or cash flow, market sentiment, emotion? Dare I say technical analysis? Be sure to leave a comment below, because I guarantee this topic is going to incite some interesting discussion. So I look forward to hearing from you guys. I appreciate you watching. Be sure to check out the Patreon, and I will see you in the next one. Have an awesome day. Peace.